quick question for you. What do you think the success rate of marriage actually is?
I mean, I guarantee I know what everyone listening is thinking.
Right. Your brain immediately just shouts 50%.
Yep. It is totally hardwired into us.
We hear it constantly. It is in movies, magazine articles. It's basically the default cultural reflex whenever modern romance comes up.
Exactly. Half of all marriages end in divorce.
Right. That's the baseline reality we've all just sort of accepted. But what if we have been calculating that math completely wrong for decades?
Completely wrong.
Yeah, simply because we are, ignoring half the population.
It really completely upends the conventional wisdom when you change the lens like that.
It does.
Because when we say 50% of marriages fail, we're only looking at a very specific subset of people.
Right, the people who actually got married.
Exactly. The ones who actively chose to walk down the aisle, sign a piece of paper, and enter into that legal contract. We're only measuring the participants.
Which brings us to the mission of today's deep dive. We are unpacking a truly fascinating, newly published paper.
A really dense one, yeah.
Very dense. It's by Zachary David Enfield, published in July 2026, and it's titled Marriage, Bureaucracy, and the Lifelong Covenant Measure.
Catchy title, right.
I know, but the twist this paper introduces is fundamentally changing the denominator of that classic 50% statistic.
Which is huge.
It's massive.
Okay.
Instead of just looking at the people who got married, Enfield asks, well, what happens if we measure the success of the marital institution by looking at the entire adult population?
Every single person.
Yeah, regardless of their relationship status.
It's a massive shift in perspective, like you said. Enfield isn't giving us, another standard demographic survey.
Right, not just comparing this year's divorce rates to last year's.
Exactly. He's constructing what he calls a strict covenant measure.
A covenant measure.
Right. By shifting that mathematical foundation to encompass the entire society, he forces us to look at the institution of marriage differently. Not just as a private contract between two people, but as a structural outcome for the population as a whole.
I was trying to wrap my head around this denominator shift when I first read the methodology, and the best way I can visualize it is by looking at sports.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think about a baseball player's batting average. Normally, we measure their success by looking only at the times they actually stepped up to the plate and took a swing.
They're at bats.
Right, they're at bat. If they get a hit half the time, they are batting 500.
Simple math.
Right. But this covenant measure does something entirely different. It's like measuring that batting average by including every single time the player walked into the stadium.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, even if they just sat in the dugout the entire game and never once picked up a bat, it counts.
Right, and if you never pick up the bat, your outcome in terms of getting a hit is an unachieved outcome. The paper essentially asks, how effective is the institution of marriage at capturing and holding the entire population within a lifelong bond?
And to answer that,
you have to include the people who never participated.
But before we can even run that math, we really have to talk about how this paper defines a hit.
Because it is strict.
Incredibly rigid. The definition of a successful marriage under this covenant measure is uncompromising.
Extremely.
There are 5 mandatory components. And if a person's life doesn't check every single one of these 5 boxes, their marital outcome is classified as unsuccessful.
The strictness is entirely the point of the model, though.
Right.
The 5 rules are designed to strip away all the modern fluidity we've assigned to relationships.
Look at one very specific historical ideal.
Exactly. A pure marital covenant.
So I want to walk through these 5 rules because they fundamentally change how we organize society in our heads.
Let's do it.
Rule number 1, it has to be a first marriage. Rule number 2, it has to be with the same spouse. Rule number 3, there can be 0 divorce.
None.
Rule number 4, no replacement marriage is allowed. And rule number 5, and this is the one that really locks it in the marriage, can only be completed by the death of one spouse.
Which is fascinating because the inclusion of widowhood as a completion rather than a disruption is a crucial differentiator.
Wait, how so?
Well, compared to standard government demographic tables, usually if you look at census data, sociologists separate everyone into distinct current buckets. Right?
Oh, like you're either never married, currently married, separated.
Divorced, widowed, or remarried. It's a snapshot of your current state.
Right. It's like a photograph of society on the day the census was taken.
Exactly. But the covenant measure is not a photograph. It's a longitudinal tracking of a single bond.
Over a whole lifetime.
Right. It takes all those separate census buckets and reorganizes them based entirely on the final end-of-life outcome,
Did that first original union reach its natural biological completion?
right, without being severed by divorce or overwritten by a replacement. In this model, surviving your spouse is the ultimate fulfillment of until death do us part.
It is the highest mark of success for the covenant,
Exactly.
which makes sense conceptually if we are strictly measuring a lifelong vow. But I have to push back hard on the terminology the paper uses here,
I had a feeling you would.
especially regarding people who don't fit that perfect mold. Classifying a lifelong single person, someone who never marries, and maybe entirely by choice.
Right, because they value their independence.
Yeah, or they prioritize their career, or they just, never found the right person. Classifying their life outcome as a failure or unsuccessful feels incredibly harsh.
It really does.
It feels like a moral judgment from some 1950s etiquette book. Why are we labeling them that way?
Well, that reaction is exactly why Enfield explicitly addresses the terminology early in the paper.
Oh, he knew it would hit a nerve.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It is very easy to read a moral indictment into those words.
Yeah.
But in the context of this specific demographic model, words like non-achievement or unsuccessful are strictly, coldly clinical.
Coldly clinical.
Yeah, they do not carry a judgment on human worth or, the richness of a person's life.
I get that it's supposed to be clinical, but come on, when you call someone's life choice an unsuccessful outcome, it carries weight.
Okay, let's frame it through a different lens.
Okay.
Imagine we are measuring the success rate of a society producing concert pianists.
All right.
If you never take a piano lesson, never touch a keyboard, and spend your entire life being a brilliant surgeon instead, you are a highly successful human being.
Sure. Yeah.
But in the specific analytical model, measuring the production of concert pianists,
My outcome is a non-achievement.
exactly, you didn't trigger the outcome being measured.
So it's like saying you didn't finish a marathon that you never even signed up to run.
Precisely. The defined outcome entering and sustaining a lifelong marital bond with a first spouse until death was never initiated.
So it mathematically cannot be achieved.
Right. The paper is measuring the footprint of the institution itself, not the happiness or validity of the individuals living outside of it.
Okay, that clarifies the intention behind the labels. It's a measurement of a specific institutional outcome, not a referendum on a person's lifestyle.
Right.
But if we adopt this incredibly strict whole population, first and only marriage until death standard, I really want to see how this plays out numerically.
It's eye-opening.
Because it sounds like it's going to just decimate the perceived success rate of modern society.
Well, the paper anticipates that curiosity and builds a highly simplified, totally transparent demographic model to demonstrate the mechanics.
Okay.
It asks us to look at a rounded micropopulation of just 10 adults.
Let's build this room. I really want to visualize these 10 people.
Go for it.
So we have 10 adults standing in a room representing a cross-section of our modern demographic reality based on the paper's source data.
Right.
According to the breakdown, 4 of the adults in this room are lifelong, never married individuals.
And applying the rules of the covenant measure we just established, because those 4 individuals never entered the marital bond.
They represent 4 unsuccessful person equivalents.
Exactly. The marathon was never started.
They never swung the bat. So right out of gate, we have 4 in the unsuccessful column.
Yep.
Now, looking at the remaining 6 adults in our room, the model states that one of them is already divorced.
Which means their first marriage has definitively failed to last until death. The outcome is locked,
So that gives us 1 more unsuccessful person equivalent,
bringing our running total to 5 unsuccessful people out of 10.
which leaves us with exactly 5 adults in the room who are currently actively married.
Correct.
Now, if I were just taking a snapshot, I'd say, great, 5 successful people. But the model doesn't allow that.
No, it introduces a projection for those 5.
Right. The paper assumes that half of those currently married adults will eventually divorce before death. And this is where my brain hit a snag while I was reading. Yeah, I need to untangle this math. If the general rule being used here is that half of marriages fail, why are we only applying that 50% coin flip to the 5 currently married people?
Ah, the distinction between observed historical fact and projected future probability is the whole engine of this specific model.
Because look at the whole room. We have 6 people who have ever been married, the 5 currently married, plus the one who is already divorced.
Right.
If we apply a flat 50% failure rate to all 6 of those people, That would mean 3 succeed and 3 fail.
Mathematically, yes.
And if we take those 3 failures, add them to the 4 never married people, our final score would be 7 unsuccessful and 3 successful. But the paper insists the final math is 7.5 unsuccessful. Where is that extra half a person coming from?
It comes from the fact that you cannot apply a future projection to an event that is already concluded.
Oh.
The one person in the room who is already divorced represents a known, observable reality. Their marriage is over.
You don't flip a coin for them anymore.
Exactly. Their outcome is a confirmed failure. The paper is very transparent that the model is built on capturing that already observed failure first.
Ah, okay. The fate of the divorced person is sealed. The data is locked in.
Yes. The 50% projection is only a tool for the unresolved marriages.
The 5 currently married people.
Right. They represent unions that are still in progress. We don't know their final outcome yet. So the model takes those 5 unresolved individuals and applies the forecasted 50% failure rate to them.
And half of 5 is 2.5.
Meaning 2.5 of those currently married adults are projected to eventually divorce.
Moving them into the unsuccessful column.
Right.
So if we run the final tally, we have the 4 never married people, plus the 1 confirmed divorced person, plus the 2.5 currently married people who are projected to divorce.
And that equals?
That equals 7.5 unsuccessful person equivalents out of our 10 adult room.
And by subtraction, the remaining 2.5 adults are the ones projected to successfully endure in their first marriage until the death of their spouse.
So the room is divided into 2.5 successful person equivalents and 7.5 unsuccessful person equivalents.
Now, obviously projecting that exactly 50% of ongoing marriages will fail is a blunt instrument.
Yeah, it feels a bit clean.
The paper admits it's a rounded modeling tool,
But I was looking at the CDC data the author pulled to justify using that 50% mark, and it is pretty staggering.
it really is.
Instead of just pulling a pop culture myth out of the air, the paper cites the CDC's National Survey of Family Growth, specifically their 2011 to 2015 analysis.
The CDC data provides the empirical anchor for the model's assumption. The survey tracked women aged 15 to 44 and measured the probability of their first marriage experiencing a disruption.
And in the CDC's terminology, disruption primarily means separation or divorce.
Right, since death is statistically rare for that specific age bracket.
The breakdown of that disruption probability over time is what really caught my eye, though.
The timeline is wild.
The CDC found that by year 5 of a marriage, there is a 22% probability of disruption. By year 10, it climbs to 36%. By year 15, it hits 45%. And by year 20, the probability of the first marriage breaking down reaches 53%.
That 53% mark at year 20 is the crucial data point here.
Right?
It demonstrates that a 50% forecast for unresolved marriages is not arbitrary pessimism. It closely aligns with long-term, real-world disruption probabilities.
Wow.
By the time a couple reaches 2 decades together, the statistical reality is that they have crossed the threshold of a coin flip chance that the union has dissolved.
It really puts the emotional weight of those numbers into perspective. We aren't just talking about quick, Vegas-style marriages dissolving in a month.
No, not at all.
We're talking about 2 decades of built lives, shared mortgages, probably children, and a 53% chance it still fractures.
It's heavy.
It makes the paper's use of a 50% projection seem almost conservative. But okay, we have our 7.5 to 2.5 ratio of person equivalents. There is a glaring logistical problem here, though.
Oh, what's the problem?
People are not marriages. You can't just count individuals and call it a day because a marriage requires 2 people. How does the paper translate a room full of singular people into actual marriage units?
The translation requires a very specific bookkeeping mechanism. It sounds abstract initially, but it is mathematically essential to maintain the integrity of the whole population denominator.
Right.
The paper introduces the rule of fractional accounting, specifically the 0.5 metric.
I love how the paper visualizes this because a single marriage is one union composed of 2 distinct persons. If we are tracking the population's individuals, every person essentially represents 1/2 of a potential union.
Exactly. For statistical accounting in this model, 1 person equals 0.5 of a marriage unit.
Okay.
It doesn't mean they are half a person in terms of worth. It is simply converting an individual-based denominator into a union-based denominator.
So let's apply that to our room of 10 people. If every 2 people equal 1 potential marriage, then our population of 10 adults represents a maximum potential of 5 marriage equivalent units.
Like 5 potential unions. Now, we apply that same conversion to our success and failure columns. We had 2.5 successful person equivalents.
Right.
If we pair them up mathematically by dividing by 2, we get 1.25 successful marriage equivalent units.
And for the unsuccessful side, 7.5 person equivalents divided by 2 gives us 3.75 unsuccessful marriage units.
Yep.
So out of a possible 5 unions in this mini society, 1.25 succeed and 3.75 fail.
And to make the final takeaway cleaner and easier to conceptualize, the paper scales the entire model up. Instead of looking at 5 potential units, it doubles the math to look at 10 potential marriage units across the population.
Which gives us the headline number of the entire study. 1.25 successful units doubles to 2.5.
Right.
And 3.75 unsuccessful units doubles to 7.5. Out of 10 potential lifelong marriage units across an entire adult population, only 2.5 are realized and preserved until death.
That is the core finding of the covenant measure. And the contrast with standard statistics is what makes it so striking.
How so?
Well, if you only look at 10 actual marriages, 10 couples who stood at an altar and filed paperwork, and apply that 50% survival premise, 5 out of 10 succeed.
Because in that standard model, you are completely ignoring the people who never got married.
Precisely.
You are ignoring the 4 people sitting in our 10-adult room who never played the game.
Exactly. But in the whole population model, lifelong never marriage remains heavily in the equation.
Yeah.
It acts as an anchor on the success side of the ledger.
Right.
That is the fundamental difference between saying half of marriages fail and saying only a quarter of the population's potential for lifelong marital bonds is actually realized.
The denominator changes everything. It completely alters the landscape of how we view societal cohesion.
It does.
And thinking about this fractional 0.5 share, I started visualizing it like a permanent ding on a credit score.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
If you get divorced, you don't just go back to being a neutral, single person in the eyes of this demographic model. You carry your 0.5 failure share in your pocket forever.
It's permanently attached to you.
Even if your ex-spouse moves to a different country or drops off the grid entirely, you are still walking around contributing your 0.5 failed marriage share to the local statistics.
That is exactly how the demographic bookkeeping tracks the continuity of the individual. The failure of the union is a historical event tied to both participants indefinitely.
Which leads me to a scenario that I think is going to frustrate a lot of people listening.
I bet I know which one.
Because it happens all the time. Let's say someone gets married really young. They are 20 years old, they don't know who they are yet, and the marriage is an absolute disaster.
Sure.
They divorce at 22, but then a few years later, they meet someone else, they rematch, they marry their second spouse, they build a beautiful, stable life, and they stay happily married for 50 years until one of them passes away.
A great outcome.
That is an incredible human achievement. Does that 50-year loving relationship really count for nothing in this model? Are they still classified as unsuccessful?
I completely understand the instinct to want to reward that 50-year second marriage, because socially and emotionally we view that as a huge triumph.
Absolutely.
But this is where the strict, teleological nature of the first and only covenant model asserts itself. The author is unequivocal.
Meaning?
The second marriage might be beautiful. It might be the defining joy of that person's life. But it mathematically cannot erase the historical fact that the first marriage failed to last until death.
It just feels so inflexible. You are branding a 50-year success story with a failure tag because of a 2-year mistake in their youth.
It is inflexible, but it has to be, in order to measure what it claims to be measuring.
Right.
The model is not measuring a person's total accumulated years of wedded happiness. It is measuring the specific endurance of a first single unbroken bond.
Once that first marriage is severed by divorce, the first marriage outcome for that individual is permanently fixed as unsuccessful.
Exactly. If you allow remarriage to overwrite the failure of the first marriage, you break the denominator again. You are no longer measuring the lifelong covenant of a single union.
You are measuring the serial accumulation of relationships.
Right. And that is a valid thing to measure in other sociological studies. But it destroys the specific covenant measure this paper has constructed.
Okay. I can accept the architectural rules of the model even if the strictness is tough to swallow emotionally.
It is a tough pill.
So We have established these incredibly rigid definitional boundaries for modern times. A marriage is a state-recognized, unbroken, first and only bond until death.
Right.
But the paper doesn't just leave us in the present day with these strict parameters. It takes a massive step back historically to ask a foundational question.
And this is where it gets really good.
Have the rules of who can marry and how a society officially recognizes that capacity always been this rigid?
The historical analysis is where the paper transforms from a pure demographic exercise into a profound sociological critique, because it directly challenges the myth of the lawless past.
This is such a pervasive idea. I think most of us assume that if you go back 300 or 400 years, before centralized government databases and standardized marriage certificates, people just kind of paired off organically.
Yeah, we picture this romanticized frontier version of history.
Right, where a couple just declared themselves married and the village accepted it with zero bureaucratic oversight.
It's a compelling narrative, but the paper uses historical legal capacity to prove it is largely a fiction.
A total fiction.
The author leans heavily on the writings of William Blackstone, the preeminent 18th century commentator on English common law, to demonstrate just how heavily structured the past actually was.
I was reading the section on Blackstone, and the specific age limits for common law marriage absolutely blew my mind. I knew things were different back then, but the numbers are shocking.
They are very low.
Under English common law in the 18th century, the established age of consent for marriage was 14 for males and 12 for females.
12 and 14. To the modern ear, which is governed by strict statutory floors of 18, it sounds like an invitation to rampant child marriage.
It sounds completely dangerous.
But Blackstone details a massive structural caveat within the common law that changes the context entirely. A marriage involving a boy under 14 or a girl under 12 was not viewed the same way a marriage between adults was.
How was it viewed?
It was legally categorized as inchoate and imperfect.
Inchoate, meaning incomplete or not fully formed.
Precisely. It meant the marriage was entirely voidable. When either party finally reached the stated age of consent, 14 or 12, they possessed the absolute legal right to reject the marriage and walk away,
Just like that.
as if it had never fully legally existed in the first place.
Wow. So it wasn't a permanent, inescapable trap if you were under that threshold. The law built in an escape hatch. When you hit the age of capacity, you had to actively ratify the decision or you could void it.
And beyond that voidable clause, Blackstone noted that canon law, the law of the church, which governed much of family life, sometimes ignored chronological age entirely,
In favor of what?
in favor of physical constitution and actual physical capacity to consummate the union.
This is where the contrast with modern bureaucracy really starts to show, because even though the common law age of consent was incredibly low and sometimes flexible based on physical capacity,
Yeah.
Blackstone's writings make it clear that the past was definitely not free of red tape. It was just a different flavor of red tape.
An incredibly dense flavor. The system Blackstone documented was heavily layered with local and ecclesiastical formalities.
Right.
You had the underlying common law, you had canon law dictates, you had the mandatory public reading of bans in the local parish for 3 consecutive Sundays so anyone could object.
Oh, wow. Anyone.
Yeah. And you had the issuance of specific licenses, rigid rules regarding parental or guardian consent, severe penalties for clergy who performed irregular ceremonies.
Restrictions on the time of day and the physical location where the marriage could occur.
Exactly. And strictly prescribed liturgical forms for the ceremony itself.
So the idea that the past was a freewheeling, unregulated romantic landscape is totally false. It was smothered in bureaucracy.
Holy some other.
But the difference is that authority was highly localized. It relied on the parish priest, the watchful eyes of the community during the reading of the bans, and the physical reality of the individuals.
Right.
It was deeply tied to the community fabric, rather than a sterile, centralized state database relying solely on a birth certificate.
That comparative analysis is the defensible historical claim of the paper. Older frameworks relied on local, familial, ecclesiastical, and capacity-based recognition.
While modern systems
Modern systems aggressively replace that localized flexibility with standardized, categorical statutory floors and centralized state records.
No, I want to interject with a really important data point from the paper, just to prevent a massive misconception for you listening. Because when we talk about the legal capacity being 12 and 14,
It sounds terrifying.
It is so easy to imagine that 18th or 19th century society was a dystopian nightmare where communities were just constantly marrying off literal children the second they hit puberty.
Right. But the paper brings in demographic data to show that the legal minimum was completely divorced from actual societal practice.
Look at the U.S. Census data the paper provides for the year 1890. Even with these low common law thresholds floating around in the legal background, the actual median age for a first marriage in 1890 was 26.1 years old for men and 22.0 years old for women.
So despite the law technically allowing marriage at 14 and 12, the vast overwhelming majority of the population was waiting until their early to mid-20s to actually tie the knot.
It completely shifts how you view the data. It means we have to clearly distinguish between what a legal system technically allows as a minimum threshold and what a society actually organically enforces as a cultural norm.
Yes.
A legal floor is a completely different creature than a societal median.
And the paper uses this 1890 data to highlight how early legal systems were clumsily grappling with the concept of capacity.
How so?
Well, the common law was trying to define the absolute earliest biological threshold where a person might theoretically be capable of making a marital covenant.
Leaving the actual timing up to social and economic norms.
Precisely. Which leads the paper to ask a fascinating comparative question.
Which is?
If English common law relied on early chronological ages layered with voidable clauses and local parish bureaucracy, how did entirely different cultures handle this exact same human threshold of marital capacity?
This brings us to the indigenous contrast in the paper, which I found to be one of the most compelling sections.
Absolutely.
And I really appreciated how the author handled this because there is a massive disclaimer right at the beginning. The paper explicitly warns against generalizing. It states firmly that there is no such thing as a single monolithic native law that can be applied across all indigenous nations.
That is a critical academic safeguard, and ignoring it is a sign of bad history. Marriage customs, kinship structures, and initiation rites differed wildly across hundreds of sovereign nations, distinct linguistic groups, and different historical periods.
Right, you can't just lump them all together.
Collapsing all of that into one generalized trope erases the complexity of those societies.
So to avoid that trap, the paper zeroes in on a very specific, historically documented example, early Virginia Indian society.
And in that specific cultural framework, the threshold for entering into marriage was not based on an arbitrary chronological birthday fixed by a distant external government.
What was it based on?
It was based entirely on observable readiness and the attainment of physical milestones.
The paper notes that for women in this society, eligibility for marriage generally aligned with puberty, a clear, observable biological milestone. But for men, eligibility was tied to something much more rigorous.
Very rigorous.
A man became eligible for marriage only after successfully completing an initiation into manhood called the Huskanah.
The Huskanah was a demanding physical and psychological initiation process. It wasn't just a ceremony.
It was a test.
Right, it was a demonstration. It required a young man to prove to the community his actual functional readiness to fulfill the rigorous obligations of marriage and community survival.
Specifically, his readiness and skill in hunting, fishing, and warfare.
When I was reading about this, I couldn't help but compare it to how we design video games.
Okay, stick with me on this analogy.
Let's explore the video game analogy. I'm intrigued.
In a well-designed video game, you unlock a new ability, or you gain access to the next level by demonstrating actual competence.
Right, you earn it.
You have to navigate a complex dungeon, beat a difficult boss, or master a specific combination of skills. You have to prove to the system that you possess the required skills to survive the next challenge.
That makes sense.
That is the Virginia Indian model. You demonstrate to the community that you can hunt, fish, and defend the village. You pass the Huskanah. You prove your competence, and in doing so, you unlock the capacity to marry.
It is a customary framework built entirely on demonstrated readiness.
Exactly. But modern statutory law, the system we live under today, is like a terrible video game where you unlock the final level simply by logging enough playtime.
Just letting the clock run.
Yes, you don't have to beat a boss. You don't have to learn a single skill. You can just leave the game running on pause for 18 years, demonstrating zero maturity and zero competence, and ping.
The achievement unlocks.
The achievement unlocks. You hit the mandatory statutory birth date, and the state declares you possess the legal capacity to bind yourself to another human being for life.
That analogy perfectly illustrates why the author includes this specific indigenous example. The purpose is not to romanticize the past or claim that one system is morally superior,
Right.
but to vividly highlight the philosophical contrast in how human societies recognize capacity.
It's a huge contrast.
A readiness-based, customary framework relies on deep social trust. It requires the community to actively observe the individual, track physical milestones, and judge their initiation.
Well, a statutory framework.
A statutory framework abandons that communal observation entirely in favor of an inflexible, universal chronological birthday dictated by a state bureaucracy.
It's the difference between a community verifying your character and a DMV clerk verifying your birth certificate.
Exactly.
They represent completely divergent philosophies of what makes a human being capable of a lifelong covenant. Which naturally begs the question, how on earth did Western society move from these localized, voidable, or readiness-based customs like the 12 and 14 common law or the Huskinaw initiation to the incredibly strict, absolute statutory floors we live under today?
All right, when did this shift happen?
When did the state fully take over the machinery?
The paper pinpoints a specific, historical legislative moment that perfectly encapsulates this massive transition. The British Age of Marriage Act of 1929.
1929. That is incredibly recent in the grand sweep of human history. Less than 100 years ago. What exactly did that piece of legislation do?
The 1929 Act was a sledgehammer to the old common law flexibility. It explicitly declared that any marriage was unequivocally void if either person involved was under the age of 16.
Void, not voidable, like Blackstone described, where the couple had an escape hatch to opt out later. Just straight up legally void.
Invalid from the very first second.
Absolutely void.
The long title of the act literally spelled out its intent. An act to make void marriages between persons either whom is under the age of 16.
Wow.
This represents the ultimate shift the paper is tracking. It is the definitive movement away from a framework that was flexible, localized, capacity-related, and voidable to a framework that is an absolute statutory floor.
It is a hard, impenetrable line drawn in the sand by a centralized state bureaucracy.
And this 1929 shift is where the paper's central, most explosive thesis really takes flight.
Right.
Because it argues that this transition wasn't just about the government wanting cleaner paperwork or tidier statistics. The paper proposes that this kind of bureaucratic shift actually fundamentally reshapes the moral psychology of a society through a four-stage feedback loop.
This four-stage feedback loop is arguably the most theoretically dense and important part of the paper. It maps the exact psychological mechanism of how a sterile legal statute eventually becomes a deeply felt cultural emotion.
We need to break down how these four stages flow into each other.
Let's trace the mechanism. How does a law change our minds? We start with stage one, capacity.
Stage one occurs when the law fixes a hard chronological age. The state draws the line, whether it's 16 in 1929 or 18 today, and dictates that anyone below that line is fundamentally legally incapable of entering a marital covenant.
Regardless of anything else.
Right, regardless of their individual physical maturity, their economic readiness, or the consent of their community.
So stage one is the creation of the barrier. Under 18, you are legally invisible. Which brings us to stage two, recognition.
Stage two is the deployment of the bureaucratic machinery to enforce that barrier.
Like the DMV of love.
Exactly. The state sets up a system of required licenses, official state records, approved officiants, parental consent forms, and judicial waivers. This machinery becomes the sole arbiter of reality.
It determines whether the union officially exists in the eyes of the law.
Right. If a couple bypasses this machinery, if they don't get the license, the state simply refuses to recognize their relationship, no matter how committed they are.
And that lack of recognition feeds directly into stage three, classification. This is where the statistics come into play.
Right.
If the state machinery doesn't recognize your union, you disappear from the official marriage category entirely. The government statisticians look at you and classify you as never married or cohabiting or unlawful. You are statistically erased from the marital column.
And that statistical erasure over decades is what generates the final, most powerful stage. Stage four, cultural feedback.
This is the mind-bending part. Let's really unpack how stage four actually works in the real world.
The paper argues that repeated legal classification over multiple generations actually trains the society's moral intuition. It teaches the population which relationships are legitimate and which are shameful.
It creates a taboo.
Exactly. The sterile statutory boundary, created in stage one, slowly calcifies into a deeply ingrained social taboo in stage four.
I want to visualize this with a hypothetical example to make it concrete.
Okay.
Imagine a couple in the 1930s, right after that 1929 act passed. They are 15 years old, they're deeply in love, they're working on a farm, they feel completely ready to start a family, and their parents support them.
Okay, setting the scene.
Under the old system, they would just go to the parish, read the banns, and get married. But now they go to the state office, and the clerk points to the 1929 act and says, no, you are 15, denied.
So they are denied stage 2 recognition.
Exactly. So they decide to just live together anyway. They build a life. But now, because they lack that state paper, they face massive friction.
Legal friction.
Yeah, they can't file joint taxes. If one gets sick, the hospital might not let the other in. The local census taker marks them down as unmarried cohabitants.
Right.
Their neighbors, seeing that the state doesn't recognize them, start to view them as living in sin or acting improperly. They are marginalized.
And then crucially, their children grow up observing that marginalization. The children internalize the friction and the shame associated with lacking a state license.
Yes. The children learn that a relationship without a state license is inherently dangerous or morally wrong.
Right.
And by the time those children have their own kids, the original reason for the friction, a purely administrative rule change in 1929, is forgotten.
It becomes a moral standard.
The requirement for a state license has morphed into a core moral belief. The newly created cultural taboo reinforces the legal structure, making it seem like the law was just reflecting the natural moral order of the universe all along, rather than actively constructing it.
It is a brilliant sociological observation. Bureaucracy doesn't just passively record reality, it aggressively creates it.
It's wild.
By controlling the definitions, the categories, and the paperwork, the state eventually controls the moral intuition of the populace.
It's incredible. But reading through this feedback loop made me realize that this isn't entirely a modern revelation.
No, not at all.
The paper brings Blackstone back into the conversation here, and it turns out he essentially predicted this entire feedback loop centuries ago.
He did. Blackstone issued a very specific, prescient warning about the dangers of placing heavy legal restraints on the gateway to marriage.
The paper notes that Blackstone argued that aggressively regulating marital capacity could hinder population increase, but more importantly, he warned that it could actively encourage unmarried sexual conduct.
Basically, Blackstone understood human nature.
Right.
He saw that if a state makes it incredibly difficult for people to enter into a officially recognized marriage by raising age limits or demanding heavy paperwork, you don't magically eliminate the human biological drive for companionship, intimacy, and family creation.
You just push those inevitable relationships outside the boundaries of official recognition and into the shadows.
Blackstone was effectively predicting stages 3 and 4 of the feedback loop long before modern sociology or government statistics existed.
He saw it coming.
If legal recognition is artificially postponed by statutory age floors, massive swaths of the population are forced to remain in the never-married classification much longer.
Right.
As the paper points out, some of those individuals will eventually marry later in life once they cross the statutory threshold. But some will form enduring relationships entirely outside of marriage.
Then some will simply remain isolated and never marry at all. The statutory gateway inevitably dictates both the timing and the classification of human relationships, which brings us crashing right into the present day.
Let's talk about today.
If this bureaucratic machinery has been actively reshaping classifications, delaying recognition, and creating cultural taboos for the last century, drawing hard lines, requiring licenses, setting strict age floors, what are the actual demographic results today? Where has this century-long feedback loop left us?
To answer that, the paper reviews modern data from the U.S. Census Bureau,
Okay.
specifically comparing historical figures from 1975 to current estimates for 2025. And the structural shift in how we live is stark and undeniable.
Let's hear the numbers. How much has the landscape changed?
Well, in 1975, married couple households made up 66% of all U.S. households. Two-thirds of the entire country lived within the structure of a married household.
It was the absolute dominant mode of existence.
By 2025, that number had plummeted to 47%. Married couples are no longer the majority. They are a minority of households.
A drop from 66% to 47% is a massive societal reorganization.
Conversely, the paper tracks the rise of the isolated individual. One-person households, people living entirely alone outside of any family or marital structure, rose from 20% in 1975 to 29% in 2025.
Almost a third of all households are now occupied by a single individual.
So we are fundamentally marrying less, and we are living alone much more frequently.
What about the timing? We discussed the 1890s census earlier, where the median age was 26 for men and 22 for women. Where does the timing sit in 2025?
The estimated median age of first marriage in 2025 has climbed to 30.8 years old for men and 28.4 years old for women.
30.8 and 28.4. So compared to 1890, men are waiting nearly 5 years longer to officially marry, and women are waiting over 6 years longer. That is a profound delay in the institutional timing of family formation.
This is a systemic delay.
Yeah.
But this raises a vital analytical question, and it is one the author handles with a lot of academic integrity.
Which is?
Did age bureaucracy and statutory floors alone cause this massive cultural shift?
Yeah.
Is the DMV entirely responsible for the decline of marriage?
Right, the classic causation versus correlation problem. Just because the government tightened the paperwork and raised the legal age over the last century doesn't mean that's the sole reason people are waiting until their 30s to tie the knot today.
Exactly. And I really praise the paper for its restraint on this point. It states clearly that demonstrating exactly how much bureaucracy caused the total modern decline would require a historical, causal analysis that is far beyond the scope of the arithmetic model presented.
So it's not claiming that bureaucracy is the sole mustache-twirling villain of the story.
No. The paper presents a conditional structural model. It argues that the bureaucracy thesis, the four-stage feedback loop, is a powerful underlying mechanism.
But it acknowledges that this mechanism operates in a chaotic environment alongside a multitude of other massive societal forces.
Right.
You have to factor in economic conditions. If a generation is drowning in student debt and cannot afford a down payment on a house, they are naturally going to delay marriage regardless of what the statutory age limit is.
Economics are a massive factor. The paper also lists the widespread availability of reliable contraception, the cultural rise of intense individualism,
The societal normalization of cohabitation without a license.
shifting gender roles, and the entry of women into the workforce, and drastically changing expectations of what a marriage is supposed to provide emotionally and financially.
It's a perfect storm of sociological factors. But the bureaucracy piece is the structural skeleton holding the arena together. It sets the rules of the game, the boundaries of recognition that all those other cultural and economic factors play within.
Exactly.
And synthesizing all of this historical and modern data, I am struck by a really profound paradox that this paper ultimately exposes about modern society.
What is the paradox you see?
We have made the bureaucratic gateway into marriage much more tightly regulated and inflexible than it was in the past. We enforce absolute statutory age floors with no exceptions for readiness. We demand state-issued licenses.
We require efficient approvals and centralized registration.
Historically, we've even demanded blood tests. We guard the entrance to the institution fiercely, like it's a fortress. But simultaneously, we have made the cultural expectation that a marriage must actually endure far less absolute.
That is a very sharp distillation of the current reality. The entrance is a rigid fortress, but the exit is entirely fluid.
Exactly. We have completely normalized no-fault divorce. We tolerate and even celebrate serial cohabitation. We accept replacement unions without batting an eye.
Right.
The gateway into marriage is heavily guarded by the state, but the covenant itself is treated by society like a revolving door. We demand strict, inflexible paperwork to officially start the union, but we no longer culturally demand the whole population first and only marriage until death standard that this paper mathematically models.
We have traded communal enforcement of the bond for state regulation of the paperwork.
That's a great way to put it.
And that paradox brings us full circle to the final takeaway of the paper, which the author distills into a very precise, quotable verdict. I think it's worth reiterating the final math for the listener, just to lock in the core thesis of the entire deep dive.
Let's hear it. What is the final verdict of the 10-person model when applied to our modern reality?
Under this specific, whole population, first and only marriage until death model, and we must constantly remember the uncompromising strictness of those definitions, only 2.5 out of 10 potential lifelong marriage units are successfully realized and preserved until death.
Just 2.5.
The other 7.5 out of 10 are classified as unsuccessful, whether through lifelong singlehood, the severing of the bond through divorce, or participation in replacement marriages.
2.5 out of 10, a quarter of the population's potential.
But the crucial caveat, which must be maintained to read this paper honestly, remains.
This is a conditional model.
Right. It is a carefully defined, conditional moral demographic model. It is a strict arithmetic exercise based on highly specific stated assumptions. It is not an empirical global statistic claiming that 75% of all human relationships are miserable failures.
Right, it's not saying that.
No, it is a precise measure answering a very specific, strict question about the preservation of a single lifelong bond across an entire society.
It all comes down to how you define the denominator, which takes us right back to the beginning of our conversation. We started by talking about the deep human desire for the comfort of precision.
The desire for a clean batting average.
Exactly. A simple binary number to explain the incredibly messy, chaotic reality of human love and commitment. And what this paper masterfully shows us is that the numbers we rely on, whether it's the cultural myth of the 50% divorce rate or the demographic reality of the median age of marriage, are never just neutral numbers.
Never.
They are the artifacts of how our legal systems choose to classify us, and how those rigid classifications slowly, invisibly shape our moral taboos over generations.
The math we cite is simply the shadow cast by the bureaucracy we built.
Which leaves me with a thought I want to leave you, the listener, to mull over long after this deep dive ends. If this paper is right and the four-stage feedback loop demonstrates that modern bureaucracy successfully turned arbitrary statutory age limits and state paperwork into deeply held, visceral cultural taboos, what other modern moral norms that we take completely for granted are actually just the long-term echoes of administrative tax categories?
It forces you to question the origin of almost every social intuition we have.
Think about it. If the state completely stopped issuing marriage licenses tomorrow, if the government just stepped out of the relationship recognition business entirely and closed the DMV of love, how would our covenant measure look in 50 years?
That's a wild thought experiment.
Would the taboo against unlicensed relationships vanish? And would we organically revert to readiness-based community customs like the Huskanaw? Or is the bureaucratic framework so permanently hardwired into our psychology now that we would continue to enforce the state's rules on ourselves, even without the state being there? It really makes you wonder how much of our deeply held morality is actually just our paperwork.
It certainly changes how you will look at the next demographic headline you read.
It really does. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.